Beyond war in South Korea: the characteristic, possibility and prospect of war in South Korea. Contribution to the Paris International Conference on May 28, 2022. In order to analyze the relation between South Korea and the war and to go forward beyond the war in South Korea, three important aspects need to be considered: first, the character of the war; second, the possibility of the war; and third, the prospects after the war. To answer these questions, it is necessary to understand the war at the historical and structural levels. This is because, like other countries, a history of Korean Revolution, including South Korea, is prolonged and complicated. 1. Having been a single nation-state for more than 5,000 years, Korea has been divided since the U.S. Army was stationed in South Korea as the occupying forces in 1945, shortly after Korea was liberated from Japanese imperialism. They established the U.S. military government, thereby dissolving Korean people's power. In the historical perspective of mankind, it is unfair that it was not Japan, a country of war criminals and defeated like Germany, but Korea that was divided, even though Korea is a victorious country which was colonized by Japan and fought against it through armed struggles. This injustice is totally because the U.S. imperialism tried to make South Korea a colony to use it as a bridgehead for an invasion of the continent. On the other hand, North Korea, where the Soviet Army entered as a liberation army, successfully carried out People's Democratic Revolution and made satisfactory preparations for the Socialist Revolution. At that time, the Second Civil War in 1945 to 1949 was underway in China. North Korea fully participated in the war, including the Northeast Liberation War, making an important contribution to the defeat of Chiang Kai-shek's army and its string puller, U.S. imperialism. In 1948, two separate governments were established in the North and South. In 1950, the Korean War began. During these 3 years of war, the death toll of the North and South each reached 2.5 million, and the entire Korean territory was burnt to ashes. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army supported North Korea, and the U.S. Army, leading the Allied forces of 16 countries, entered the war on the side of South Korea. In addition to the Allied forces, in consideration of South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, there was an incomparably vast imbalance of military forces between two sides. However, the U.S. eventually could not help signing a ceasefire. North Korea celebrates this Armistice Day as Victory Day. From the point of view of North Korea, the Korean War was a national liberation war aimed at achieving national independence for the whole of Korea. Meanwhile, from the point of view of the U.S., it was a war of imperialist invasion to expand its occupied territory and its bridgehead for a continental invasion from the south to the north. Every national liberation war is a just war, and every imperialist war of aggression is an unjust war. There are different opinions on the reason for the outbreak of Korean War, but there is no disagreement on the definition of the character of this war according to the positions of each state. Afterward, North Korea and China agreed to automatically assist each other, without any condition, whenever either of them went to the war against foreign imperialist forces. The agreement in 1961 between North Korean leader Kim Il-sung and a former Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai was reaffirmed by the meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and North Korean President Kim Jong-un during Xi's visit to North Korea in 2019. This means a solid pact has been made between North Korea and China that China will promptly participate in the war if the North enters the war against U.S. imperialism and vice versa. This is one of the important reasons why China, like never before, solved the Hong Kong issue decisively with mobilizing the police force in 2020 and has actively prepared for the Taiwan War. Like the successive color revolutions around Russia, Taiwan's secession from China would lead to a series of secessionist movements in Hong Kong, Tibet, Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia, driving China into an unprecedented worst political crisis. China has set up two strategic goals before 2021, the 100th anniversary of Chinese Communist Party. The first is to reach the state of Shaokong, state of relative comfort, corresponding to a GDP of $10,000 per capita. The other goal is to obtain the first island chain, the line of islands connecting Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines and Indonesia through the South China Sea. Once China retains this island chain, it will be able to strengthen its security, reunify Taiwan and advance in the Pacific. On the other hand, the U.S. would retreat from the Western Pacific and lose Taiwan and its hegemonic supremacy in that region. Taiwan has the world's largest semiconductor companies, such as TSMC, which are sorely needed by both China and the U.S. China has already achieved the first goal, State of Shaokong, in 2019, earlier than expected, but has not yet achieved the second goal, the First Island Chain. It will hold the 20th Congress of Communist Party of China in the end of this year, where the question of the third term for Xi Jinping will be decided. It's more essential than ever for General Secretary Xi Jinping and the Communist Party of China to solve the Taiwan problem as well as the economic problem. 2. With this historical background around the Korean peninsula, there is a confrontation between the triangular system of North Korea, China, and Russia in the northern part and the triangular system of the US, Japan, and South Korea in the southern part. If the scope is expanded, Taiwan would be included in the southern triangular system. In South Korea, the Moon Jae-in reformist government was established in 2017, which supports peace and reunification, so that South Korea significantly drifted into the Northern Triangular System through North Korea's National United Front strategy and the development of China-South Korea trade relation, resulting in a serious crack in the Southern Triangular System. The Panmunjom Declaration on April 28, 2018 and the Pyongyang Joint Declaration of September 2018 were the works of North Korea's National United Front strategy. In South Korea, the share of foreign trade with China became twice larger than that with the US. It intensified the South Korean capital's shift from pro-American to pro-Chinese character. The South Korean economy is very vulnerable to external shocks because it is a subordinate economy where its capital composition, equipments, raw materials and market are vertically subordinated to the imperialist systems in the process of reproduction. It's also because it is a deformed economy where its heavy industry, light industry and agriculture are fragmented and hypertrophied disproportionately. Under the global crisis of capitalism, the COVID-19 pandemic and the hybrid warfare in Ukraine are deepening the economic crisis beyond the financial crisis in 2008 at the US and global level. The South Korean economy, already considerably damaged, would be fatally wounded if a war broke out in Taiwan, not to mention a war in South Korea. The fashionable slogan in South Korea at the moment is, security with the US and economy with China. This slogan points out an incompatible contradiction between the operational control of the South Korean military subject to the US and its economic trade that is very close with China. After the victory of the fascist forces in the presidential election in South Korea in March 2022, the government's policies have been shifted to strengthen the alliance with the US and Japan, exacerbating the composition of the conflict between the Northern Triangular System and the Southern Triangular System centered on the Korean Peninsula. Yoon Suk-yeol is the pro-US and belligerent figure who has defined North Korea as the main enemy and has proclaimed the preemptive strike against North Korea and resumption of the nuclear drill to invade North Korea during his presidential election. In this sense, the Yoon Suk-yeol government is essentially no different from the Poroshenko government which emerged in 2014 in Ukraine. As the Poroshenko government is a proxy government of NATO and a fascist anti-Russia government, the Yoon Suk-yeol government is a proxy government of the US imperialism and a fascist anti-North Korea government. In South Korea, none of pro-Japanese collaborators during the Second World War were liquidated, and they remained in place, becoming the puppet of US imperialism, organizing the army and the police. Even with the military coup in 1961, the pro-US military fascist government had been built for 30 years and led South Korea to become a prison without bars, or the living hell where democracy and human rights are infringed. In Gwangju in 1980, the people, who were waging armed struggle against the fascist military government, were cruelly slaughtered by the pro-US military fanatic fascists under the control of the US imperialism. For South Korean people, the genocide in Odessa, Ukraine in 2014 and the massacre in Donbass that lasted for 8 years are not such alien events. The 30,000s of US troops, stationed in South Korea, fully seize operational control of South Korean military. The US forces in South Korea constantly carry out biological weapon tests at several places, including the anthrax bacillus and botulinum toxin, which are deadly to humans. The US forces in South Korea are armed with the various tactical and strategical nuclear weapon and conduct the military exercises annually and frequently. According to the 2020 Defense White Paper of the South Korean military, the US-South Korea joint military exercise were conducted 172 times in 2020. The nuclear war exercise against North Korea was carried out in April 2022 on a large scale and it is still being conducted just on a smaller scale. Recently, during Biden's visit to South Korea from May 20 to 22, the Doomsday Plane Airborne Command Post in case of nuclear war was deployed along with 3 nuclear aircraft carriers and a nuclear submarine. Besides, the hospital ship and transport ship, which usually appear on the eve of the war, were also seen. Accordingly, North Korea has powerfully counteracted by test-firing new types of tactical and strategical nuclear weapons that it has been developing for some time, and by fully presenting them at the military parade. At present, the Korean peninsula is in the extremely dangerous situation, and it would not be surprising if war broke out immediately. 3. The character of the war is the National Liberation War and the just war on the side of North Korea, and is the imperialist war and the unjust war on the side of the U.S. The communist forces and genuine patriotic nationalist forces in South Korea and abroad cannot but take the same stand with North Korea, while the fascist forces in South Korea and abroad cannot but have same position with the U.S. As our nation is a homogeneous nation for 5,000 years, both the Korean War in 1950 and the future war that may be called the Second Korean War are the 100% internal affairs of our nation. It is clear that a war against the imperialist foreign forces that intervene has the character of national liberation war. As for the forces in between, i.e. the reformist forces in South Korea and abroad, they are generally those who seek peace and reunification. According to the historical experience, in the phase of war, they will be on the side of nation that opposes the foreign forces. In Korea, from the time of anti-Japanese struggle and through the Second World War to the present day, the communist forces and nationalist forces have formed the National United Front and joined the National Liberation Revolution together. In the history of whole Korea as well as South Korea, the nationalist forces, as the National Independent Forces, have always taken a stand against foreign forces and for national liberation. Korea has experienced war in its history and is structurally in the condition that a war can break out. And recently, the possibility of war has reached an unprecedented level. While the pro-US fascist forces have seized power in South Korea, the confrontation between the Northern Triangular System and the Southern Triangular System centering around the Korean Peninsula expedites the military conflict. The situation in East Asia, where China is decisively promoting to solve the Taiwan issue, and the situation in Ukraine, where the war between Russia on the one hand and NATO and neo-Nazi forces on the other hand is going on, constitute the international conditions that accelerate the march towards a war on the Korean Peninsula. As for the post-war prospects, of course, that would depend on the outcome of the war. If the National Liberation Forces win, the People's Democratic Revolution will be completely conducted, under the situation that the U.S. troops and fascist forces are removed. Naturally, the next strategic phase to eliminate the class distinction will be carried out. The reunification of Korea can only take the one way of the federal system with one nation and two systems and two governments, due to the different conditions between the social systems of the North and South. It is certain that when class emancipation is achieved in South Korea, Korea will proceed to the unification of the system with one nation, one system and one government. Currently, the political situation in South Korea is passing through the period of great upheaval, reminding of the period of the Second World War. In this period of great upheaval, when the National Liberation Revolution triumphs in Korea and consequently the People's Democratic Revolution wins in South Korea, alike the period after the Second World War, it would be advanced, through the period of great transition, to the period of great upsurge. We are convinced that the historical and revolutionary truths that only the revolutionary idea of working class and the revolutionary party of the working class can achieve the single-mindedness of the working class and the working people, and that united people will never be defeated. We affirm the strategic significance of the internationalist unity of the working class and working people. The South Korean Revolution and Korean people will prove this truth again in practice. To the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, the current world situation and the immediate tasks of the international communist forces. Contribution to the Paris International Conference of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform on October 14, 2022. Finding the right solution to the following theoretical and practical problems for the unity and practical struggle of the world's anti-imperialist forces, including the communist forces, is more important today than ever, when the war is already being waged in Eastern Europe and just before the wars in East Asia. In relation to the war in Eastern Europe, the Ukraine war, a controversial issue with the nature of the war is the character of Russian society. Similarly, concerning the Taiwan war and the South Korean war, the character of Chinese society is also the issue with the nature of the wars. Regarding the nature of the war in Ukraine, the theory of inter-imperialist war and the theory of liberation and preventive war stand in opposition to one another. In the background of this confrontation is the question of the character of Russian society, in which two theories, the theory of Russian imperialism and the theory of Russian capitalism, oppose each other likewise. The theory of inter-imperialist war naturally presupposes the idea of Russian imperialism, while the theory of liberation and preventive war generally rejects the theory of Russian imperialism and acknowledges the theory of Russian capitalism. Liberation and preventive war theory views this war as a liberation war from the conditions of massacres and the oppression of Russian-speaking people in Ukraine, including Donbass, as well as the preventive or self-defensive war against a US/NATO invasion of Russia with the Ukrainian forces in the lead. The theoretical limitations and errors of the theory of Russian imperialism are clear. It has not been satisfactorily proven by the proponents of this theory that Russia meets the core economic characteristics of imperialism specified in Lenin's imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, which are a financial oligarchy, economic division of the world, and the territorial division of the world among the imperialist powers, etc. It cannot refute the view that key reasons why imperialists have colonies, according to theory of contemporary imperialism, because they are advantageous investment markets of capital, markets of surplus goods, suppliers of cheap raw materials and labor. These don't apply to Russia and sometimes even stand in opposition to its reality. Those who insist on the theory of Russian imperialism mostly also support the theory defining China as imperialist. Repeating the same analytical errors, they intentionally disregard the essential socialist features which are especially guidance of the Communist Party and all people's ownership of the most important means of production in China. In some extreme cases, they even go so far as to put forward the theory that Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, is an imperialist country. Not everyone who affirms the theory considering China as imperialist considers the Taiwan War an imperialist war, but the fact that one of the initiating forces of the international communist movement defines the Ukraine War, the Taiwan War and even the South Korean War as imperialist wars is a serious problem that must not be overlooked. Not only the Fatherland Reunification War of Korea, which has been a single nation-state for 5,000 years, the South Korean Liberation War to drive out the U.S. imperialist aggressive forces that have forcibly occupied South Korea, also the Fatherland Reunification War of China, which aims to liberate Taiwan, a part of China since the end of Middle Ages, the Taiwan Liberation War, are both national liberation wars. The extremists, who consider that not only Russia and Socialist China but even the DPRK the most thorough socialist country are imperialist, naturally regard Socialist Cuba as imperialist also. Therefore, it comes as no surprise at all that they see Iran and Venezuela, Rwanda and Mozambique as imperialist countries likewise. To them, capitalism means imperialism. Even a socialist country, if it has markets and trade, it is capitalist and therefore imperialist. This is a blanket denial against the highest stage of capitalism as the essential definition of imperialism. Absolutely, it is no wonder that such non-dialectical and metaphysical thinking, which denies the historical stages, based on subjectivism, leads its exponents to fall into the trap of this schematism. Those who take as their starting point the idea of Russian imperialism fail in practice to meet the tasks of the present era, and fall back on comforting parallels with the Second World War and the anti-fascist alliance of that period. They don't see the fact as it is, that the United Front, which the Socialist DPRK and China have built with Russia, is the World Anti-Imperialist Front. Because the main targets of the World Anti-Fascist Front that was built during the Second World War were fascism in Germany, Italy and Japan. If the wars break out in East Asia as well, which will be called the Third World War, about this war, the main targets will be the USA, the EU, and the Japanese imperialists, so the United Front will be the World Anti-Imperialist Front. The South Korean War and the Taiwan War are liberation wars both against U.S. imperialism. When looking at its surface, the Ukraine War could be regarded as an anti-fascist war that fights against the neo-Nazi fascist forces. But in its essence, it is the anti-imperialist war that fights against NATO. The neo-Nazis are a marionette of NATO. The main target, a strategic target, is NATO, and the neo-Nazis are the secondary target, a tactical target. Defining the nature of the war must be achieved by identifying the main target, i.e. the strategic target. The same is true of South Korean situation. Fascism is the ruling method of the imperialist forces. Imperialists control the working class, including the working masses, sometimes through fascism and sometimes through reformism. The U.S. imperialists have used fascism mixed with reformism in their methods of dominating South Korea. However, neither the U.S. nor the British imperialists have so far ever had to rule their working class and working people through fascism. Today's international issue is imperialism, not fascism. Fascism is a domestic issue in some countries of the world, and is very limited. Today, the revolutionary struggle on a global scale which the international communist forces have to lead is the anti-imperialist struggle. The international communist forces must maintain their own identity as the revolutionary forces of the working class in their own countries. However, at the same time, they must build united fronts rallying other forces under the banner of anti-imperialism and conduct joint action both in their own countries and internationally. That is to say, forming the World Anti-Imperialist United Front and developing the World Anti-Imperialist Joint Action. The World Anti-Imperialist Platform must take the role of a locomotive force for organizing this united front and joint action. In the present conditions of anti-imperialist war being waged in East Europe and with the imminent approach of a decisive anti-imperialist war in East Asia, we are confident that the world anti-imperialist forces as well as the international communist forces can finally gloriously move forward the victory of world anti-imperialist revolution by playing the most important political role in organizing broad working class and working masses as one and powerfully mobilizing them into a struggle that can decisively hit imperialist forces. The rising tide of global war and the tasks of the world anti-imperialists. Contribution to the Belgrade International Conference of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, hosted jointly with the new Communist Party of Yugoslavia, NKPJ, on December 17, 2022. Amid the rising tide of global war, what are the tasks of anti-imperialists? In Eastern Europe, the war in Ukraine is ongoing, and in East Asia, wars in South Korea and Taiwan are imminent. Military tension has been mounting in the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. The world economy is in crisis owing to high inflation, high interest rates and high exchange rates, and people's daily lives have reached the point of breakdown. At the crossroads of destiny, the people, who are teetering on the cliff edge of survival, are asking us, the revolutionary parties of the working class, how to survive. Now is the time to deeply review historical experience, in particular the development of world war from the Great Depression of the 1930s. As history proves, imperialism always brings with it the threat of war. Without invasion and plunder, imperialism cannot survive. The main method by which the imperialist powers try to escape their domestic political and economic crises is by waging war abroad. War allows monopoly capital, which has seized control of its home state, to create huge profits, which has the effect of accelerating the militarization of the home economy. Today, the military-industrial complexes in the imperialist countries, having disposed of many of their conventional weapons and standing armies, have found new means of waging war. The brutal air war waged by NATO against Yugoslavia in the Balkan Peninsula in the 1990s, and later against Serbia, was one such example. It is the same with the war crisis in East Asia, which has been escalating as well. US and European imperialism violated the agreement they made with the Soviet Union, later Russia, pushing through NATO's eastward expansion and eventually causing the current Ukraine situation. Today's war is the result of the West continually fabricating color revolutions and grooming neo-Nazi forces across the region as part of its grand chessboard strategy. It is also the result of the horrific massacre in Odessa, after which followed the Maidan coup in 2014, and of the 14,000 Donbass victims during 8 years of anti-fascist war, as the documentary film Ukraine on Fire made perfectly clear. It is no longer a secret that NATO special forces, notorious for Operation Gladio, have long maneuvered Bandera's descendants in secret, covertly training them to occupy Donbass by waving a false flag and preparing to use them for an assault on Russia. We can understand the interrelation between the war crisis in Eastern Europe and the war crisis in East Asia through various historical facts of the last century. James Aylward Van Fleet, the U.S. military general who oppressed Greek partisans in 1948, went on to serve as supreme commander in the Korean War. When NATO was bombing Belgrade in 1999, the imperialists intentionally bombed the Chinese embassy. Creating a climate of fear, the USA threatened North Korea by conducting war exercises against it, Oplan 50-27-98, or Operational Plan to Invade North Korea, and by letting William J. Perry visit North Korea. Today, the Serbs living in the northern part of Kosovo are under constant threat of ethnic persecution and genocide, living under the shadow of the huge U.S. military Camp Bondsteel base, the biggest one in the Balkan Peninsula. With great concern, we see that the flame of war that has broken out in Ukraine could easily spread to Serbia. Furthermore, it reminds us that North Korea and China, as blood alliance nations, will have no choice but to closely coordinate their strategy and tactics if one or both of them finds itself having to wage a similar war against imperialist aggression as they had to once before. Just as it used the puppet Zelensky regime in Ukraine to provoke Russia, U.S. imperialism has been using the Yoon Suk-yeol regime in South Korea to provoke the DPRK, and the Tsai Ing-wen regime in Taiwan to provoke China. A complex history since the days of the Kievan Rus may inform different views on the ethnic commonality between Russia and Ukraine, but even the USA cannot deny that the people of Taiwan and China are one, indigenous peoples on the island constituting just 1% of the population in the region having been part of China since medieval times. Likewise, nobody in the world can deny that North and South Korea are one nation, having had a 5,000-year united history. Thus, it is clear that there is no basis for division or external meddling in the internal affairs of either Korea or China. However, U.S. imperialism, which has become a byword for aggression and plunder and the chieftain of modern imperialism since the mid-20th century, has been eager to find a way to divide and weaken Korea and China, and to this end is combining its favored approach of a proxy war with its latest military doctrine of hybrid war. These ceaseless provocations, which seek to cross the red lines that have been made quite clear by the governments in Beijing and Pyongyang, are totally unacceptable to both North Korea and China. It is obvious that U.S. imperialism and its followers are absolutely responsible for any war that results from this aggression in South Korea or Taiwan and for the Third World War towards which we are being pushed by the unceasing war drive across the world. History will record that while this war was an unjust war as far as the aggressive imperialist powers were concerned, it was a just war on the part of all the forces of anti-imperialism and national liberation. Furthermore, just as WW2 was defined as a world anti-fascist war, WW3 will be defined as a world anti-imperialist war. Just as the Socialist Soviet Union formed a world anti-fascist front with the USA and Britain, which were imperialist powers allied to the anti-fascist front in the WW2, so today Socialist North Korea and China are forming a world anti-imperialist with capitalist Russia. The World Anti-Imperialist Front can also be defined as a combination of anti-imperialist armed struggle forces as the main force with anti-imperialist mass movements as the secondary force. The World Anti-Imperialist Platform, as a unified body of the communist and non-communist anti-imperialist forces, regards itself as the locomotive of anti-imperialist mass struggle waged on a global scale. This expresses itself in the waging of a powerful anti-imperialist mass struggle, in correcting the wrong theoretical line in the anti-imperialist camp, and in raising the level of the revolutionary political forces of the working class. In practice, these aims are fulfilled by holding international conferences to analyze the developing political situation and establish a joint strategy, and by organizing anti-imperialist mass struggles simultaneously all over the world. Yesterday, our anchor was weighed in Paris, Western Europe. Today, it is in Belgrade in Eastern Europe. Tomorrow we will be on another continent, one of the Third World. We will be tireless in working to alert the masses of the world to the aggressive nature of imperialism and to the counter-revolutionary dangers of opportunism. At the same time, we will do everything in our power to take the initiative in working for the unity and victory of the world anti-imperialist forces, performing to the best of our ability the noble contemporary mission of rousing the revolutionary political forces of the working class in this vital struggle. In this moment, for us, there are no slogans as desperately touching our heart as workers and peoples of the world, unite, and the people united will never be defeated. We are convinced that the approaching moment of great global change will be the moment when imperialism will be decisively defeated on a global scale, advancing humanity into the new world in which the masses of working people become the masters of national sovereignty and means of production, that the coming period of world anti-imperialist war will lead to a period of a great revolutionary turn, exceeding the revolutionary upsurge that followed the anti-fascist war of the last century. The rising tide of world war and the base of anti-imperialist revolution. Contribution to the Caracas International Conference of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, hosted jointly with the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, PSUV, on March 4, 2023. While 2022 was the year in which war broke out in Ukraine, Eastern Europe, 2023 is the year in which war is very likely to break out in South Korea and Taiwan, East Asia. The war in Ukraine was caused by NATO's policy of eastward expansion and the USA's strategy of dissolving the Russian Federation. Russia, upholding the cause of its anti-imperialist, anti-fascist and preventive war, is prevailing on the battlefield with its overwhelming military power and elaborate strategy and tactics. After their initial successes, the propaganda of Western media producing fake news have definitely lost their powers to deceive the world's people. At the same time, anti-war and anti-government sentiment is spreading amongst the populations of Ukraine and Poland. With their strategy of attrition and proxy warfare failing to work out as expected in Ukraine, the U.S. invaders are shifting their gaze to East Asia, trying to escape their decisive crisis by continuously and intensely provoking conflict via their war exercises against North Korea and their backing of the separatist movement in Taiwan. The wars currently being triggered in South Korea and Taiwan are particularly serious since the possible use of tactical nukes has been raised by the imperialists. East Asia includes not only Northeast Asia but also Southeast Asia. Recently, the USA reached an agreement with the Philippines to use for areas near Taiwan as U.S. military bases. Meanwhile, Japan has doubled its defense budget compared to last year and decided to deploy 100 missiles in Okinawa toward Taiwan, declaring its preemptive strike capability in the name of a counterattack capability. With the escalating separatist movement under the control of the U.S. imperialists, like Japan, Taiwan has invited newly elected House Speaker of the U.S. Congress, as it did in August 2022, and has imported U.S. weapons in bulk by dint of loan from the U.S. As we all know, China can never allow Taiwan to secede, since this would inevitably have a domino effect, triggering more U.S.-backed color revolution attempts in Hong Kong, Tibet, Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia. As with the fascistic and bellicose Zelensky regime in Kiev, the USA recently established the fascistic and bellicose Yoon Suk-yeol regime in Seoul, which is accelerating the fascistization of the country and committing to ever more and bigger war exercises against North Korea. Along with all this, the death of former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe last July was a catalyst for accelerating the revival of Japanese militarism, while Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in August escalated the military tensions surrounding the province. This was closely followed by the nuclear war drill against North Korea, joined by the U.S. nuclear aircraft carrier USS Ronald Reagan, being entered South Korea in September, was conducted with unitedly the U.S., South Korean and Japanese militaries in East Sea. The new Cold War strategy of the USA in East Asia and its accompanying warmongering maneuvers are not responses to any hostile action, but have been thoroughly premeditated. Unlike landlocked Eastern Europe, East Asia is next to the sea, and so any war which breaks out there has a far higher probability of involving some kind of limited nuclear weaponry. The tactical nuclear bomb, which is less powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima but capable of making an extremely powerful precision strike, has been designed to target the underground bunkers of an enemy's military command in modern warfare. The true intention of the U.S. Army as it carries out its ferocious nuclear war exercises against the DPRK, including decapitation operations, is clear. North Korea, China and Russia are all nuclear and missile powers possessing both hydrogen bombs and hypersonic missiles. If these countries were to carry out a swift attack using tactical nuclear weapons, or to use their hypersonic missiles to carry out an EMP, electromagnetic pulse, strike, the USA's much-vaunted nuclear carriers would become defenseless. If the USA attacks the territories of the North Korea, China, and Russia, then these three countries would counterattack the US mainland with nukes. The balance of fear resulting from this mutually assured destruction, MAD, has led the USA to embrace proxy warfare, using pro-US puppet regimes in hybrid warfare premised on non-nuclear as its fundamental military doctrine. East Asia, following Eastern Europe, is now the region most likely to break out into war. If the flame of war spreads from Eastern Europe to East Asia, this would result in a Third World War. Since the war in Eastern Europe is ongoing and the war in East Asia is imminent, sooner rather than later, the world anti-imperialist forces should brace for the Third World War which imperialism is now attempting to provoke. Not only Eastern Europe and East Asia, but the whole world, including Latin America, must squarely face the severity of the current situation and actively fight against imperialism and its aggressive wars. Like Asia, Latin America and Africa have long suffered from colonialism and being a colony of imperialism. It is no coincidence that Asian and African people held their international conference in Indonesia in 1955 and issued the Bandung Declaration. Now it is time not only for Asia and Africa, but also for Latin America, for all oppressed and developing countries to stand together as one and go forward with the banner of anti-imperialism and independence held high. Latin America, which was for many years the colony of Spain and Portugal, is today at the forefront of opening up a new era for anti-imperialist independence and people's democracy, refusing to remain as the first colony of U.S. imperialism. We pay attention to the revolutionary advance, starting with the Cuban Revolution and followed by those in Nicaragua, Bolivia, and elsewhere. We highly evaluate the victory of the Bolivarian Revolution and the achievement of ALBA, Alianza Bolivariana para los Pueblos de Nuestra América. Since revolution and socialist construction are carried out in each national state as a unit, each country's historical and structural distinctive characteristics must be respected and taken into account. It is a principle that the identity of a revolutionary party of the working class and the noble cause of internationalist solidarity must stand consistently on the revolutionary process as dictated by the particular conditions of their country, without left or right-wing deviations. In the general political situation in Latin America, which is becoming more and more revolutionized, besides adherence to the revolutionary principle and maintenance of the strategic line, it is important to keep in mind seasoned tactical measures suitable for the specific conditions and changing situation when aiming for a society in which the working people, including working class, are to be the master of the state power and the means of production. The World Anti-Imperialist Platform. The platform is an organizational weapon of the World Anti-Imperialist Forces that has three main goals: to wage an effective anti-imperialist struggle, to indicate the correct line to the struggling forces, and to strengthen the international communist movement, which should be at the heart of that struggle. The platform aims to achieve these goals by hosting international conferences and organizing simultaneous worldwide anti-imperialist struggles, thus uniting theoretical and practical activities and bringing together all those who are serious about opposing US-led imperialism. In Paris, France and Western Europe in October 2022, the platform, holding the first international conference, announced its program, the Paris Declaration, and in Belgrade, Serbia in Eastern Europe in December 2022, it organized a second international conference, where for the first time a rally in March coincided with a worldwide anti-imperialist struggle, in Caracas, Venezuela. In Latin America in March 2023, we are again holding the third international conference, which will be followed for a second time by a rally in March and a worldwide anti-imperialist simultaneous struggle. Our movement was launched in Paris, France, which, although it is an imperialist country, is also the home of the French Revolution, the Paris Commune and the WW2 anti-fascist resistance. It has traveled through Belgrade, the capital of the former Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia, one of the key members of former Socialist Bloc and victim of NATO's barbarous 1999 bombing campaign. Today, we are holding our first event in the oppressed world, here in Caracas, Latin America, the capital of Venezuela and the heart of the Bolivarian Revolution and of ALBA. Some forces in the international communist movement are ridiculously and unreasonably insisting that the ongoing war in Ukraine is an inter-imperialist war and that the imminent wars in Taiwan and South Korea will likewise be inter-imperialist wars. These self-proclaimed communists define not only Russia but also China, North Korea and even Venezuela and Cuba as imperialists. The extremely subjective opinion that every country with even a small element of capitalist market is thereby imperialist can only benefit the imperialist forces, inducing the revisionism which denies the historically proved revolutionary truth, the opportunism which creates left and right-wing deviations, and the factionalism which splits the international and domestic communist movements. To this grave danger, not only communist forces but also anti-imperialist, independent forces must be alert. Today, since the imperialist forces are colluding as one, the anti-imperialist, independent forces must also unite as one. Since the imperialist forces are oppressing with an aggressive war, a fascist repression, an exploitation and a blockade, the anti-imperialist, independent states and movement must strongly struggle against imperialism, against fascism, and against every form of oppression and exploitation. In that sense, it is natural for international communist forces and world anti-imperialist forces to fully support and stand in solidarity with Venezuela's historic choice and strategic stance of opening up the path for socialism and adhering to the line of building a self-supporting economy. The weapons of the anti-imperialist forces are justice and truth, unity and struggle. The people united and struggling for justice and truth, for real freedom and welfare, never know defeat. It is totally impossible to reverse the new revolutionary era, in which the oppressed and exploited people of the Third World come to the fore and proceed towards the building of self-reliant and independent societies, and in which the working people become the masters of political and economic life. The people are the masters of history, and the revolution, that locomotive of history, proceeds following the independent aim of the people. At this primary base of anti-US and anti-imperialist Latin America, in Caracas, Venezuela, where is the new revolutionary base which people-centered, we shout with victorious faith, imperialism cannot avoid its doom. The people united under the banner of the anti-imperialism and independence will assuredly win. The people united will never be defeated. Hugo Chávez's shining achievements. Memorial address at the mausoleum of Hugo Chávez, commemorating the 10th anniversary of his death, in March 2023. We can summarize Commander Hugo Chávez's contribution to the anti-imperialist struggle, a contribution whose legacy is with us today, into 5 significant achievements. First, he found revolutionary methods that were suitable for Venezuela, and successfully implemented them. As we well know from the collapse of the Salvador Allende government in Chile, revolution cannot be achieved by purely electoral means. Our history shows that armed struggle and popular uprising are necessary to change society. Following the examples of Cuba, Nicaragua and Algeria, the Venezuelan model was developed. Comandante Hugo Chávez educated and organized 10,000 soldiers in his army, and led them to rebellion. In spite of the military failure of this revolt, he won people's hearts, enabling him to come to office through an election. It is noteworthy that in my own country, the U.S. occupiers thoroughly control our military. In order to prevent a similar national liberation trend arising in the South Korean army, they replace commanders often and retire them early. Second, he led the Bolivarian Revolution. By revitalizing the spirit and achievements of Simon Bolivar, he was able not only to reawaken the spirit of anti-imperialist struggle but also the aim of Latin American unity. Under such a symbol, the Venezuelan revolutionary movement has been able to embrace not only revolutionary military and working people but also middle strata, and not only in Venezuela but across the continent. This is why ALBA, Alianza Bolivariana para los Pueblos de Nuestra America, one of Venezuela's most important revolutionary accomplishments, remains in the limelight to this day. ABLA has played a most important role in helping the Venezuelan people face the most difficult ordeal of the atrocious US-led economic blockade. Understanding the need for strength in numbers, the People's Democracy Party of South Korea also emphasizes the policy that Western Pacific countries should form a single economic and peace community. Third, the Bolivarian Revolution established a number of missions for the people and by the people. Comandante Chávez personally planned, pushed ahead and represented, in a way that everyone can easily understand, the essence of people's democratic reform measures by the revolutionary governing group. It was a policy for the people and a policy by the people at the same time. He set an example, shining beyond the century, by making a policy that collected the independent demand of each person, and accomplished the policy by harnessing the creative abilities of those people. In particular, even in the worst economic situation resulting from the combination of low oil prices and the economic blockade, Comrade Nicolas Maduro, who succeeded Hugo Chávez as president, achieved a most noteworthy success in fulfilling the Great Housing Mission. We have seen some of this success for ourselves when we held an architecture exhibition with Jean-François Parent in Seoul, South Korea, to which we invited legendary Latin American architect Fruto Vivas, and in our own visits to Venezuela. Along these same lines, the People's Democracy Party of South Korea popularizes the slogans, "Give back their own goods to the people," and "Starting from serving the people through the reappropriation of the wealth, let us constantly advance people's welfare." Fourth, Comrade Chávez led the construction of a party, the PSUV, that has characteristics of United Front. This was done by boldly embracing parties and political organizations that had the same desire to carry out a people's democratic revolution for the people and by the people. A similar type of party, ACAL, exists in Cyprus, in the Mediterranean, although ACAL began its life as a communist party. We in South Korea also had the experience of building the Democratic Labour Party, comprising almost all progressive political forces within South Korea in 2000, but it was forcibly disbanded after 15 years by the fascist government. The enemies of the working people, including working class, are most afraid of the progressive forces, including the revolutionary forces, uniting politically as one. Fifth, the Bolivarian Revolution has led to the beginning of the construction of the Commune. We are thrilled that Hugo Chávez's last words were not about the party but about the commune. With the words, commune or nothing, comuna o nada, he left a most weighty instruction in the last moments of his life, reminding the people that the most important goal for organizational building, political building remains the construction of the commune, which the revolutionaries and activists must keep there in mind for life no, for forever. We revolutionaries and activists from South Korea also sincerely regard this as our most crucial aim. During the earlier stages of the Korean Revolution, after our liberation from Japanese imperialism in WW2, our people began to build a regime which took root among the people along the lines of the commune. In the South, this was destroyed when the U.S. forces entered as an army of occupation. In the North, on the other hand, it won success after success and has been continuously developed since that time. The value of any life can be seen from the shine of its achievements. There can be no doubt that the life and contribution of Hugo Chávez will continue to shine forth in the history of his homeland, of Latin America, of the working people and of humanity. The period of the Great Turn. Beyond the period of Great Transition, towards the period of the Great Upsurge. Contribution to the International Anti-Fascist Conference in Minsk, hosted by the Communist Party of Belarus and the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, on April 22, 2023. The war in Ukraine was clearly provoked by the U.S. imperialism and NATO. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union and Eastern European socialism, NATO has threatened Russia with a relentless eastward expansion policy. What does the fact tell us that the imperialist forces dissolved Yugoslavia and NATO bombed Belgrade in 1999? What is the goal of their strategy, as Brzezinski's great chessboard, to bring not only France, Germany and Poland but also Ukraine into NATO? What is the intention of U.S. imperialists in making the extreme fascist Bandera a Ukrainian hero and systematically fostering neo-Nazi forces instead of putting him on trial for war crimes? Who controlled and supported the Ukrainian fascist forces that massacred tens of thousands of people in Donbass alone for 8 years since the Maidan coup in 2014? As the documentary testifies, what is burning in Ukraine is the madness of fascism, and its victims are entirely ethnic Russians. It is NATO that is spreading fake news with the 21st century Ukrainian version of Operation Gladio, and it is the people of the world who are being deceived. Even without mentioning the history of the Duchy of Kievan Rus and Lenin's proposition, Ukraine is the head of Russia. The entire world now knows that Russians and Ukrainians are almost one nation, as shown in the statement issued by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of DPRK. In conclusion, the problem between Russia and Ukraine is a national internal problem, and no foreign forces should intervene. It is essentially no different from the China-Taiwan or North Korea-South Korea issue. China has recognized Taiwan as an inalienable territory since the Middle Ages, and Taiwan's indigenous population is only 2%. Korea has been a completely single nation since at least 5,000 years ago. As history teaches, the intervention of imperialist foreign powers has led to bloody wars and disorder, and in this course the people have always paid the price. We have to remember the objective fact that 2.4 million people in the North and 2.5 million in the South were slaughtered in the 1950s Korean War, mainly by the U.S. imperialism. We should not forget the fact that the U.S. imperialism, which dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, also considered to drop the atomic bomb on Korea and China when it became unfavorable in the war. Korea is both a victim and a victor nation in the war against Japanese militarism, but the absurd history that Korea should be divided instead of the war criminal Japan is entirely due to the U.S. imperialism. The U.S. imperialism, which used nuclear weapons for the first time in the history of mankind, has never stopped trying to invade North Korea since it occupied South Korea in 1945 and has not hidden its diabolical intention to use tactical nuclear weapons against North Korea in this course. It is also the U.S. imperialism that has formed the so-called the U.S.-Japan-South Korea Trilateral Military Alliance and mobilizes the U.S. nuclear carriers and nuclear bombers to conduct the nuclear war exercises against North Korea daily. To this end, the U.S. imperialism elected the pro-U.S. fascist Yoon Suk-yeol, a combination of Petro Poroshenko and Volodymyr Zelensky, as a South Korean president last year and manipulated and supported him to turn South Korea into a tundra of human rights and democracy, and the prison of fascism less than a year when he became the president. In early April, it was also the U.S. imperialism to organize the Taiwanese president Tsai Ing-wen's visit to the U.S., provoking China as much as possible, and at the end of April, to make the South Korean president Yoon Suk-yeol's visit to the U.S., prompting and provoking North Korea at the peak. The U.S. imperialism intends to complete to form the U.S.-Japan-South Korea trilateral alliance in preparation for a nuclear war against North Korea by Yoon's visit to the U.S. and the U.S.-South Korea summit. Therefore, it is not surprising that ahead of his visit to the U.S., he remarked to directly support the weapon to Ukraine. If we do not overthrow Yoon Suk-yeol, the worst pro-U.S. fascist and warmonger in history, who is the main agent of U.S. imperialism, promotes the revival of Japanese militarism and provokes a nuclear war with North Korea, with outbreak of the Second Korean War, the Korean peninsula could be turned into a nuclear battlefield and graveyard. In other words, while the war in Ukraine broke out in Eastern Europe in 2022, the wars in South Korea and Taiwan are very likely in East Asia in 2023. The war in South Korea and the war in Taiwan are closely linked, and if one breaks out, the other will break out almost at the same time. There is no other reason why South Korean people are struggling every week in Gwanghwamun Square in the center of the capital, insisting resign the Yoon Suk-yeol government and down with Yoon Suk-yeol. The South Korean economy, which is subordinated to the imperialist monopoly capital and structurally distorted, is very vulnerable to an external shock. Its vulnerability is further deepened by the IMF crisis of 1997 and the U.S. financial crisis of 2008, and it reached the verge of explosion by the unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic and the three highs panic of high oil price, high interest rate, and high dollar. It is no coincidence that among industrialized societies, South Korean workers and workers in the workplace where there is endless competition and endless exploitation, where they work the longest hours and have the lowest wages, and most of them are temporary workers, record the highest suicide rate in the world. The South Korean people on the brink of the cliff of Hell Joseon, South Korea, have no other way out but the uprising, and have nothing to lose but their chains of imperialism and fascism. As in Russia 100 years ago, the people in the collapse of their livelihood and the war crisis will follow the scientific guidance, the locomotive of revolution will move forward on the path of fundamental transformation. In the historical period of the Great Turn, beyond the period of Great Transition, to the period of the Great Upsurge, it is the motive force of revolution that plays a decisive role. Our party is convinced of the slogans proletarians of the world, unite, and the people, united, will never be defeated. We are convinced of the power of the scientific truth, and the power of working people united around Revolutionary Party of Working Class. Under the banner of communism and internationalism, we who organize the working people and be in solidarity with the world people, are certain that the task of justice, the task of revolution, to advance the realization of a new society in which the people are the masters of the regime and the means of production, and to continue to move forward for the final victory of the people should win. Let us march forward towards victory, holding higher the banner of anti-imperialism. Contribution to the Seoul International Conference of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, hosted jointly with the People's Democracy Party, PDP, on May 15, 2023. Today we are living in the era of the Third World War. In Eastern Europe, the war in Ukraine broke out in 2022, and in East Asia, wars in South Korea and Taiwan are imminent. The Third World War began with the war in Ukraine and will become global with the outbreak of war in East Asia. The war in South Korea and the war in Taiwan are essentially connected. Therefore, these wars in East Asia are on one battlefield. At the moment, there is fighting on only one theater, in Eastern Europe, but when the battlefield in East Asia forms, there will be two battlefields. The single front that embraces these two theaters of war is the United Anti-Imperialist Front. Consequently, the formation of East Asian battlefields leads to one front and two battlefields, one anti-imperialist front spanning two battlefields in Eastern Europe and East Asia. While battlefields also exist in the Middle East and Latin America, and contradictions in the USA itself are intensifying, the war theaters in Eastern Europe and East Asia have a different characteristic, which is their potential to provoke a nuclear conflict between the world's largest militaries. Unfortunately, Eastern Europe and East Asia are the most dangerous places where tactical nuclear weapons are most likely to be used in practice. The U.S. imperialists have already deployed their B-61-12 tactical nuclear missiles to Italy, Poland, Germany and other sites in Europe. In East Asia, F-35 stealth bombers, which can carry a B-61-21, have frequently been involved in war exercises aimed at North Korea. The infamous 1990s Oplin 5027 nuclear war plan targeting the DPRK has recently been expanded and modified into Oplin 5029, 5030 and 5055. With the inauguration of the Yoon Suk-yeol government last year, nuclear war and invasion rehearsals have been conducted with unprecedented frequency and ferocity. The imperialist alliance, including the USA, pushed forward with its strategic plan for the eastward expansion of NATO after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the East European Socialist Bloc in 1991. While bombing Belgrade in 1999, NATO forces even destroyed the Chinese embassy. Dismantling Yugoslavia, the imperialists didn't conceal their aim of expanding the same balkanizing model to Russia and China. From the mid-1990s onwards, they pursued a policy of isolating and suffocating the DPRK, even causing 2 million North Korean people to die of starvation. The imperialist forces' strategy of dismembering Russia and China and destroying the DPRK has been embodied in various provocative maneuvers over the last 3 decades. Each time, Russia, China, and North Korea had to exercise the utmost patience to prevent a war crisis. However, the 8-year genocide of ethnic Russians after the Maidan coup in 2014 and the NATO-led neo-Nazi invasion of the Donbass crossed a red line for Russia. For China, the stoking of the Taiwan independence movement. And for North Korea, the advent of a fascistic belligerent government in South Korea and their plans for a preemptive nuclear strike exercise against it, are also crossing red lines. The war situation in East Asia developed fiercely in the second half of last year as the suspicious assassination of Prime Minister Abe last July helped promote Japan's plan for remilitarization. This was combined with U.S. House Speaker Pelosi's provocative visit to Taiwan in August, and the dangerous entry of the Reagan nuclear-powered aircraft carriers into South Korea in September. Already this year, Taiwan's president visited the USA, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol visited Japan to meet with Kishida and finalized the formation of the US-Japan-South Korea Trilateral Military Alliance, and even more nuclear war exercises were conducted against North Korea, mobilizing a US nuclear aircraft carrier, nuclear submarines, and nuclear bombers. East Asia finds itself now on the brink of a nuclear war that really could break out at any moment. Among all South Korea's pro-US stooge governments, the most corrupt and incompetent, the most fascistic and belligerent of them all has been the new regime of Yoon Suk-yeol. Under the orders of its puppet master, the USA, Yoon Suk-yeol visited Japan to finish the formation of the US-Japan-South Korea Trilateral Military Alliance, which is described as the Asian NATO, and strengthened the General Security of Military Information Agreement, SOMIA, frantically conducting nuclear war exercises against the DPRK alongside the USA and Japan. In the unprecedented economic crisis that broke out amid the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, and fueled by the 3 highs of high oil prices, high interest rates and a high dollar, the economic crisis in South Korea is now surpassing the 1997 IMF crisis, the state of economic trusteeship in which South Korea had to receive a bailout from the IMF, and the 2008 financial crisis that spread across the world from the United States banking system. As a result, the South Korean people are suffering their worst conditions in decades and are being driven to the brink in this hell-chosen South Korea, where now it has the highest suicide rate in the world. Our people are holding candlelight demonstrations by themselves and are moving towards a people's uprising by the popular demand having escalated from resign Yoon Suk-yeol government to overthrow the Yoon Suk-yeol government. Believing that we are on the verge of witnessing a decisive counterattack by the anti-imperialist forces against the provocations of imperialism, it follows that the organization of mass anti-imperialist struggle on a global scale has become an urgent practical task demanded by the times and the people. The World Anti-Imperialist Platform, as the first of its 3 goals, affirms its intention to organize this anti-imperialist mass struggle, holding World Anti-Imperialist joint struggles every month. Along with members of the platform, we have launched the platform news website and strengthened our social media presence, doing what we can to expose the provocations and atrocities of imperialism and to spread information about the achievements of the growing anti-imperialist struggle day by day. In Latin America, where the anti-imperialist mass struggle is part of daily life in many countries, we recently held our 3rd international conference and organized an anti-imperialist demonstration in Caracas, Venezuela, on the 10th anniversary of the death of Comandante Hugo Chavez. As the contradictions between the anti-imperialist forces and the imperialist bloc are intensified, the maneuvers of the revisionist, opportunist, factionalist group in the international communist movement are becoming more severe. It is logical and predictable that the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, standing at the spearhead of the ideological war, should be slandered by the factionalist and opportunist groups, which revise revolutionary principles, commit left and right opportunist errors, divide the international communist camp, and objectively serve the interests of the enemy. against the fact that international factionalist and opportunist groups recklessly counter Lenin's thesis on imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, with the absurd imperialist pyramid theory, claiming that every capitalist country and also an imperialist one, disturbing and splitting the international communist camp as Kautsky and Trotsky did. The World Anti-Imperialist Platform is impelled to wage its scientific ideological warfare more sharply and militantly. Having insisted that Russia is imperialist and defined the war in Ukraine as an inter-imperialist war, the international factionalist and opportunist groups are now repeating their error, defining China as imperialist and declaring that the imminent war in Taiwan will also be one of inter-imperialist rivalries. They even declare the DPRK to be a capitalist country because it has some elements of the market and conducts trade. Following the logic of their argument that every capitalist country is imperialist, they finally define North Korea as imperialist and consider the imminent war in South Korea as another result of inter-imperialist rivalries. Despite the fine words and insinuating looks, the counter-revolutionary nature of international factionalist and opportunist forces has already been exposed. Proven by the Caracas International Conference in Latin America, there is no sincere communist or anti-imperialist force on that continent that regards Russia and China as imperialist and defines the war in Ukraine as an inter-imperialist war. And we find the same in Asia and Africa. As time goes by, the errors of the opportunists are being revealed by practice and theory, becoming ever more obvious. It is inevitable that the promoters of these ideas will become more and more isolated in the world. Aiming to spread world anti-imperialist mass struggle to conduct an ideological warfare against the international factionalist and opportunist forces, and to strengthen the international communist movement, we will make every effort to remain at the forefront of this struggle. We will go forward resolutely, follow the direction of revolutionary science, hold higher the banner of the just anti-imperialist war, and keep shouting powerfully the two slogans proven by our history and practice: proletarians of all countries, unite, and the people, united, will never be defeated. The struggle of our united people will transform the period of great upheaval that we are experiencing into a period of great transition in near future, and will ultimately be developed into a period of great uprising. As we mark the 80th anniversary of the victory of the Soviet forces at Stalingrad, we are convinced both scientifically and with our all hearts that a great victory is on the horizon, one that will echo and even surpass the victory of the popular forces in the Second World War. The revolutionary forces of the world are firmly united under the banner of anti-imperialism and fighting for the final victory. Contribution to the conference in Athens, organized by the Revolutionary Unification, on June 10, 2023. The Balkans and the Korean Peninsula share an important historical commonality from the 20th century. They both fell victim to the Cold War and suffered from massacres and fascism. Fascism here does not refer to a variant of imperialism but to one of the two main methods used by imperialism to rule through neocolonial proxy regimes, either fascism or neoliberalism. Specifically, Greece is the only country in the Balkans that was thwarted in its march towards socialism and shrouded in the madness of fascism. This is exactly the same as South Korea on the Korean Peninsula, which was prevented from moving to a new stage of social development after World War II and had to go through the ordeal of civil war and fascism. As a consequence, their social movements were dialectically strengthened, which explains why today, facing a new world war, these two countries have become the most important hotbeds of social revolution. We held the International Conference of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform last December in Belgrade, Serbia, which inherited the tradition of Yugoslavia and shares in the important history of the Balkans, and today we are holding an equally important conference in Athens, Greece. It is no coincidence that these events are taking place here. South Korea is on the eve of war. While the war in Ukraine broke out in Eastern Europe in 2022, the war in South Korea and Taiwan is imminent in East Asia in 2023. At the root of the situation, where it would not be surprising if war started now, is the imperialists' aggressive provocation. As we know, since the 20th century, imperialism has been solely responsible for wars, whether these were global or local wars. World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnamese War, the Iraq War, and the Syrian War were all waged by imperialism. The ongoing war in Ukraine is no different. The U.S. imperialist orchestrated Maidan coup in 2014 and the NATO-backed 8-year massacre in Donbass from 2014 to 2022 were a combination of imperialist manipulation and fascist brutality and a thoroughly planned provocation to invade Russia. It is no longer a secret that U.S. imperialism, under Brzezinski's infamous Grand Chessboard strategy, has been supporting neo-Nazi forces, including the Azov Regiment, and manipulating false flag operations and fake news while waiting for a decisive moment. Naturally, Russia had no choice but to make an urgent decision, faced with the possibility of being dissolved like Yugoslavia by imperialist aggression, so the special military operation began, and now real war is just around the corner as declared on May 9, Victory Day. Imperialist provocations, specifically NATO's provocations using Ukraine, will continue to intensify, and Russia will take a defensive stance and make a decisive counterattack at some point. It is no longer a secret that the counterattack is linked to the war in East Asia. North Korea and China respectively conducted the three-day operations in November 2022 and April 2023. North Korea even repeated the first day's operation plan on the fourth day. Of course, both North Korea and China conducted these military exercises in self-defense, as a countermeasure against the aggressive imperialist war, including all U.S. imperialist and political provocations. Last year, in particular, North Korea responded to the nearly daily nuclear war drills which were part of the massive U.S.-Japan-South Korea joint air exercise called Vigilant Ace in November, combining an unprecedented 500 combat aircraft maneuvers with test launches of various missiles. China responded to President Tsai Ing-wen's visit to the United States in April. China responded to the U.S. House Speaker's visit to Taiwan in August last year with missile tests and naval military exercises encircling Taiwan, and North Korea also test-fired 2 tactical nuclear cruise missiles toward Okinawa, a U.S. military base that could be used in a war in Taiwan. It is now common knowledge, even in conservative media, that if either one of the South Korean or Taiwan wars breaks out, the other will automatically follow. Recently, Yonhap, a representative South Korean news agency, reported that China's gold buying and its U.S. Treasury bond selling are at an all-time high, and in particular, pointed out that its arms exports in the past 5 years have decreased by 23% from the previous 5 years, drawing a parallel to the fact that the Ukraine war broke out when Russia's exports decreased by 31% over an equivalent period. It also emphasized the fact that while the 30-year confrontation between North Korea and the United States from the early 1990s eventually led to a prevailing peace, the recent period has been completely different. In fact, recently, the imperialist powers held a G7 meeting in Hiroshima from May 19 and 21 to prompt the finalization of the formation of an Asian version of NATO. Even Zelensky participated in the meeting, during which the aggressive intentions to expand the Ukrainian war in Eastern Europe to the South Korean and Taiwan wars in East Asia, and more blatantly, their proxy war and hybrid war methods based on the new Cold War strategy, were exposed. In response, China has sought to develop relations with the 5 Central Asian countries, and Russia has sent a delegation headed by its prime minister to strengthen strategic ties between the two countries. This is in line with President Xi Jinping's diplomatic campaign, which included visits to Saudi Arabia at the end of last year and Russia this year, as well as inviting French President Emmanuel Macron and Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva to China this year. The strategic development of relations among the members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, centered on the relationship between China and Russia, is particularly marked by the unity of the Arab world, led by Saudi Arabia, and the agitation of Western Europe, including France. In short, the weakening imperialist powers are trying to turn the situation into a new war, while the anti-imperialist line between the socialist North Korea, China, and the capitalist countries, including Russia, is strengthening at various levels. In particular, North Korea changed its stance from power for power and goodwill for goodwill to power for power in response to the U.S. dual-track policy. Specifically, since the 8th Party Congress in 2021, North Korea has proposed and implemented a new path, that is, non-peaceful independence and peaceful reunification, which is to solve the problem of independence non-peacefully and then solve the problem of reunification peacefully. This means that if the U.S. and South Korea continue to conduct war maneuvers against North Korea, the North will eventually eliminate the South's government and military warmongers through the non-peaceful use of self-defense of armed force, declaw the U.S. military, prevent Japanese military intervention, liquidate the pro-American and pro-Japanese forces in the South, and establish a democratic government in the South to achieve peaceful federal reunification with the socialist government in the North. If this happens, from the viewpoint of the North, the war in South Korea will be a war against the U.S. military, which entered the South as an occupation army and retains control of the South's operational authority, a war of national liberation and national reunification, and a just war in which Korea, which has been a single nation for half a millennium, will be united again. By contrast, it will be an imperialist and unjust war from the US side. Despite this truth, some communist forces, such as the Communist Party of Greece, characterize South Korea as imperialist and the war in South Korea as an inter-imperialist war. This is because they also view the socialist North as imperialist. This absurd view is not a theory, but a pseudo-theory, a bizarre and crude concept that is being spread by the Communist Party of Greece under the name of the theory of imperialist pyramid. First of all, this revisionist theory, which denies the core content of Lenin's imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, views all capitalism as imperialism. As a result, it denies the significance of the anti-imperialist national liberation revolutions in the oppressed countries and the tactics of anti-fascist front during World War II, and insists only on class liberation and socialist revolution. In the end, the line of the Communist Party of Greece, which advocates this petit bourgeois theory rooted in Kautskyism, Trotskyism, and postmodernism, is revisionism and opportunism, and the current Communist Party of Greece is driving international sectarianism that is dividing other parties with its false theories. With the rise of Khrushchev's modern revisionism and the removal of Nikos Sakaridis and other revolutionaries from the party, it seems that revisionism and opportunism began to crystallize in the Communist Party of Greece. Of course, we must distinguish between revisionism within the Communist Party of Greece and the Communist Party of Greece itself. It is not the Communist Party of Greece itself that we oppose, but the revisionism and opportunism within the Communist Party of Greece. Since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine in February 2022, the Communist Party of Greece has become more convinced of the theory of imperialist pyramid, imposing this false line on the international communist movement and deepening divisions. Amidst this urgent situation and conscious of the gravity of the problems, the World Anti-Imperialist Platform was launched in October 2022 with an international conference in Paris, France, with 3 goals: anti-imperialist mass struggle, ideological warfare, and strengthening the international communist movement. With organizing international conferences and the World Anti-Imperialist struggle as its basic methods, the World Anti-Imperialist Platform is stridently achieving its fundamental goals by holding events in Belgrade, Serbia in December 2022, in Caracas, Venezuela in March 2023, and in Gwangju and Seoul, South Korea in May. We are convinced that the harder a flint is struck, the brighter it shines, and that the militant practical struggle and sharp ideological struggle of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform will continue to shine brighter and brighter, contributing to the correction of errors within the World Anti-Imperialist movement and the international communist movement and strengthening the new tide of unity. Taking the scientific ideas of the working class, proven by history and practice, as our revolutionary conviction, and chanting the slogans "Workers of the world, unite," and "The people united will never be defeated," we will continue to struggle unflinchingly in the face of all trials and difficulties, in firm solidarity with the revolutionary forces in the world, including the comrades of the Greek Revolution, and advance and realize the day of final victory. The 3 major goals of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform. Article published in the Platform number 3 in August 2023. When the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, the Platform, was founded, 3 major goals were stipulated. These were the strengthening of the anti-imperialist struggle, the strengthening of the ideological struggle within the anti-imperialist and communist movements, and the strengthening of the world's communist forces. These are the most important goals according with the essential character of the platform, and they are closely related. Since its establishment in Paris, France in October 2022, the platform has devoted its energies to these 3 major goals by holding international conferences and by organizing demonstrations and rallies alongside its other activities in Belgrade, Serbia in December 2022, in Caracas, Venezuela in March 2023, and in Gwangju and Seoul, South Korea in May 2023. The first goal of the platform is to promote the anti-imperialist struggle. This is the most important goal of the World Anti-Imperialist Platform. Strengthening the World Anti-Imperialist struggle means strengthening such struggles in one's own domestic country as well as coordinating with other anti-imperialist struggles around the world. The anti-imperialist struggle of each country and the corresponding anti-imperialist struggle on a worldwide level are in a dialectical relationship between the individual and the general. Anti-imperialism means opposing the forces of imperialism. In this sense, opposing means not only opposing the imperialists' policy, but also the existence of the imperialist system itself. It means fighting until all traces of imperialism are eliminated. And opposing does not only mean the negation of the physical existence of imperialism but also the affirmation of the existence of an opposite to imperialism, a commitment to socialism. This is not anti-fascism, it is anti-imperialism. In the Second World War, the anti-fascist forces won victory by forming anti-fascist fronts on a global scale. Today, when the Third World War is imminent, the front that must be organized globally is an anti-imperialist one, although this does not preclude the formation of anti-fascist fronts in particular countries or regions. It is worth remembering that fascism during the Second World War was just one variant of imperialism, a way to maintain the dominance of the imperialist ruling classes over their domestic populations during a period of intense class struggle. The fascism that we see in the world today, by contrast, is exported by the imperialists to their puppet states in the oppressed and colonized countries that are subordinate to imperialism. In the current conditions, imperialism is the main target of our attack, while fascism is an auxiliary target. Various forms of struggle must be combined. We need to always pay attention to the combination of political struggle and economic struggle, legal struggle and semi-legal struggle, large-scale struggle and small and medium-scale struggle, focused struggle and decentralized struggle, daily struggle and struggle at particular opportunities, spearheading struggle and mass struggle. The second goal of the platform is to intensify ideological warfare. The targets of ideological warfare are revisionism, opportunism and sectarianism. Revisionism denies the revolutionary essence of Marxism-Leninism, opportunism sells out the long-term interests of the revolution to the short-term interests of all or a few and commits right and left errors, while sectarianism divides our ranks. Revisionism is an ideological problem, opportunism is a matter of political line, and sectarianism is an organizational problem. Revisionism, opportunism and sectarianism are closely interrelated as three aspects of the same entity. They are all effects of the capitalist class's pressure on the struggle of the working class, and tend towards bringing about a split in the ranks of socialism, thus neutralizing us as a major force in world politics. Today, the main focus of the platform's ideological warfare is the sectarian opportunism of the Communist Party of Greece, KKE. The leadership of the KKE has fallen into the trap of revisionism since it expelled the sincere revolutionary General Secretary Nikos Sakaridis and his revolutionary comrades from the party in 1957 under the influence of Nikita Khrushchev, the ringleader of modern revisionism. In recent times, the KKE has caused confusion and division within the communist ranks inside or outside its own country, engaging in severe right and left opportunism and sectarianism. SolidNet, the authoritative solidarity network in the international communist movement, has virtually finished its life as it has failed to fulfill its periodic, political and organizational duty owing to the sectarian opportunism of its principal organizer, the KKE. This is comparable to the failure of the Second International to fulfill its role because of the opportunism of Karl Kautsky and others, and its end with the First World War. Will the KKE's theory of the imperialist pyramid surpass in infamy Kautsky's theory of ultra-imperialism? Just as Kautsky drew on English bourgeois economist J.A. Hobson's ideas about inter-imperialism, so the KKE's pyramid theory is tainted by petty bourgeois theories, including Trotskyism, defining all capitalist countries as having some level of imperialist development and stating that every capitalist country in the world without exception constitute the imperialist pyramid. On Imperialism, the Imperialist Pyramid by Oleka Papariga, 2013. The KKE has had the temerity to revise the very title of Lenin's epoch-defining work Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism of 1916. In the history of revisionism, it is rare to find such an audacious case of revising even the title of a book. In this sense, Lenin's foresight in emphasizing the importance of stage in the title shines through. Like this, the imperialist pyramid theory denies stages and thus denies any tactics in the revolutionary movement. It is no coincidence that the KKE, as Trotsky also did, denounces the Comintern's tactic of organizing an international united front against fascism, denies the revolutionary nature and existence of national liberation struggles in the oppressed world, and committed left opportunist errors during the popular uprising in its own country in the early 2010s. It no longer surprises anyone that Dimitris Koutsumbas, the General Secretary of the KKE, in an interview with the mainstream media in May, likened Russia's special military operation to NATO's bombing of Yugoslavia. The war in Ukraine has brought to the fore the ideological problems of the KKE. It is the nature of such opportunism as that of the KKE's leadership to betray Leninism while quoting Lenin's words, to recycle the words and justifications of the NATO imperialists while claiming to be against imperialism, and to immerse itself in Euro-communism while condemning it. The problem is that the leadership of the KKE, as revisionists and opportunists have historically done, incites other parties to follow the same path of revisionism and opportunism, and if they refuse, it intervenes in them organizationally to break them up. These criminal acts, which have taken place countless times, from Spain a few years ago to Argentina this year, objectively confirm that the KKE is the leading international sectarian force dividing the international communist movement today. The platform fights not against the KKE itself but against the revisionism, opportunism and sectarian. KKE opposes Leninism while referring to Leninism, opposes revolution while referring to revolution, and opposes anti-imperialism while referring to anti-imperialism. Thus the ideological warfare against the revisionism, opportunism and sectarianism of the KKE's leadership ends with an accurate description of Leninism, revolution and anti-imperialism. In this sense, the recent decision by the Congress of the Communist Party of Belgium, PCBCPB, is very encouraging. The third goal of the platform is to consolidate the international communist forces. The reason we talk about consolidating not the communist parties but the communist forces is that the communist powers at present are not only organized in parties but also in other types of political organization. As we know, after the 1990s, communist forces everywhere went through some very hard times. The prerequisite of the principle that there should be only one communist party in any given country is that the traditional communist party in each country should follow a correct revolutionary line and should play its historic role with consistency and dedication. But in reality, many parties did not do so. In the present conditions, it is an inescapable reality that militant communists in many countries have had to create alternative political organizations outside of the traditional party formation in order to conduct revolutionary activities. In the global anti-imperialist struggle, not only communist but also many non-communist forces from oppressed countries can join together under the banner of anti-imperialism. In this sense, to strengthen the world anti-imperialist struggle means creating a united front, with communists in the lead. Strengthening the forces of international communism in this united front context is like strengthening the revolutionary forces in any one country. It guarantees a better and more resolute leadership for the whole struggle. Strengthening the international communist forces in such a context is like strengthening the party in a domestic context. Just as the relationship of a party and a united front can be compared to the relationship of the vanguard and the transmission belts in one country, so the international communist forces and the world anti-imperialist forces have to build the relationship of the locomotive and the rail cars of the struggle train on a global scale, metaphorically speaking. In other words, the international communist forces must further develop their role within the world anti-imperialist movement as a vanguard that can put forward the correct line and powerfully organize and mobilize the people. While the anti-imperialist struggle targets maximum force against the primary enemy, the communist movement aims to build a vanguard for the masses' struggles, not only against imperialism, but for socialism, which is the only real solution to the problems facing humanity. The international communist forces achieved great advances in the period of the Great Turn. The First International was formed after the February Revolution of 1848, the Second International after the Paris Commune of 1871 and the Third International after the Russian Revolution of 1917. The First World War was the decisive trigger in exposing the rottenness of the Second International, which had been steadily misled by Eduard Bernstein and Karl Kautsky after the death of Friedrich Engels. After the victory of the October Socialist Revolution in Russia, led by Lenin and the Bolsheviks, the Third International was built. During the period of the Second World War, the Third International was dissolved for the reasons that the subjective forces of the revolution in each country had strengthened, and in order to facilitate the inclusion of the USA and Great Britain into the World Anti-Fascist Front. With the victory of the World Anti-Fascist Front in the Second World War, the International Socialist camp was greatly enlarged, spreading across Eastern Europe and East Asia, while national liberation movements in the oppressed world gained unstoppable momentum. During the Second World War, the World Anti-Fascist Front strategy of Joseph Stalin and Georgy Dimitrov was the most important stratagem leading to the victory of the anti-fascist forces, isolating the fascist camp and preventing the world's imperialists from devouring the socialist USSR together. Nowadays, the World Anti-Imperialist Front that has been formed by the Socialist DPRK in China with capitalist Russia and other countries should be regarded in a similar light as the World United Front against Fascism that the Socialist Soviet Union created with the imperialist USA and Britain as a force capable of smashing the main enemy and unleashing a new wave of revolutions in the world as the imperialist system falls ever deeper into crisis and fails to reinvigorate itself through new conquests in war. In 2022, the Ukrainian war escalated in Eastern Europe. When war spreads to South Korea and Taiwan, it will be indisputable that the Third World War has arrived. This world war, which has undoubtedly been provoked by the imperialist side, will bring about another period of great transition following the victory of the War of Liberation in East Asia, decisively hastening the doom of the imperialist forces and moving the world into a period of great upsurge. The anti-imperialist struggle, ideological warfare, and the communist forces are interconnected. The anti-imperialist struggle is our practice, ideological warfare is our theory, and the communist forces are our organization. Anti-imperialist struggle and ideological warfare have the relationship of practice to theory, while ideological warfare and the communist forces have the relationship of theory to organization. The communist forces and the anti-imperialist struggle have the relationship of organization to practice. In the present day, anti-imperialism is justice and pro-imperialism is injustice. History demands of us that the just anti-imperialist front and the just anti-imperialist war must be victorious. The proletariat and people of the world must be united under the banner of anti-imperialism and advance towards the final victory of socialist revolution. In this serious moment, when the full outbreak of the Third World War is imminent, the platform will do its utmost to accomplish its sacred three-point goals of strengthening the anti-imperialist struggle, strengthening the ideological struggle, and strengthening the international forces of communism. The character of the war. Article published in the Platform No. 4 in September 2023. Essence and characteristics are different but closely related. Each being or movement has innumerable characteristics, but their essential characteristic is the most important aspect that distinguishes them from one another. In short, essential characteristic corresponds to the what of 5W1H, what, who, where, when, why and how. To understand this what, we need to answer the question of the why. What and why are the two main components of a goal. Without knowing what and why, we can never know how. War is a struggle. The battle between those waging a just war and those waging an unjust war is one of the starkest class struggles. The highest level of class struggle is a revolutionary war, and the category of revolutionary war includes an anti-imperialist war. What should we make of the Ukraine war that broke out in Eastern Europe in 2022? This is a question about the character of the war in Ukraine. More specifically, a question about its essential character. In other words, what is the war in Ukraine, and why did it happen? The simple and clear answer is that it is an anti-imperialist. An anti-fascist war, a liberation war, and a preventive war. This describes the war from the anti-imperialist camp's viewpoint and directly from the standpoint of Russia. For Russia's opponents, the war has the opposite character. The war in Ukraine is an anti-imperialist and anti-fascist war. Waged by Russia, it is an anti-imperialist war against imperialist NATO and also an anti-fascist war against the Ukrainian fascist forces, puppets of imperialist NATO. Russia called the war in Ukraine a special military operation at the beginning of the war in February 2022 and revealed three goals: denazification, demilitarization, and protection of its population. The elimination of the Azov battalion in Mariupol in May 2022 was an example of the denazification. The seizure of an underground arsenal in Bakhmut in May 2023 was an example of the demilitarization, and the merger of Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson was an example of protection of the population. Further, President Putin first referred to the conflict as a war in December last year and did so again at the Victory Day ceremony on May 9 this year. While the war in Ukraine appears to be a war between the Russian and Ukrainian armies, but it is in reality a war between Russia and NATO. The actual operational direction of the Ukraine's military forces lies with NATO, and its soldiers are trained and its weapons are mainly provided by NATO. Other NATO forces are also directly and indirectly involved in the war in Ukraine in various forms and ways, whether as commanders or soldiers. Without NATO's involvement, the war in Ukraine would have been over long ago. In fact, it would never have started. The war in Ukraine is a liberation war. It did not begin in 2022 but in 2014. Its roots go as far back as 1991 with the counter-revolution in the Soviet Union and Eastern European Socialist bloc. Indeed, the imperialists' plan to use Ukraine against Russia goes back to the 1950s and even earlier. NATO's eastward expansion policy since 1991 is one of the root causes of the war in Ukraine, and the Maidan coup in 2014 and the subsequent 8 years of fascist genocide against the Russian people is one of the direct causes of the war in Ukraine. Therefore, from Russia's point of view, the war in Ukraine is a liberation war to free the Russians and the Ukrainian people from fascist and beastly repression. The war in Ukraine is a preventive war. The imperialist powers have continuously pursued isolation, division, and collapse strategies against Russia. From the infamous grand chessboard strategy of Zbigniew Brzezinski to NATO's eastward expansion policy and a succession of engineered color revolutions to depose independent-minded or Russia-friendly governments in former socialist countries. In February 2022, NATO was secretly propelling its forces towards a full-scale invasion of the besieged Donbass. Its attack forces were based in Mariupol and spearheaded by the neo-Nazi Azov Battalion. NATO, which had already invaded and dismantled Yugoslavia in the 1990s, was working on such a plan, so naturally, Russia had no choice but to prepare. There is a view that defines the war in Ukraine as an inter-imperialist war. The premise of the argument is that Russia is an imperialist country, fighting in Ukraine for colonies and spheres of influence. According to this view, Russia is no different in essence to the imperialist leaders of NATO, namely the United States and Western Europe. This view rests on an unscientific characterization of Russia's social character, which in turn is based on a wrong understanding of imperialism. The most egregious case of this erroneous reasoning can be found in the theory of the imperialist pyramid put forward by the Communist Party of Greece, KKE. Russia is not an imperialist but a capitalist country with lots of socialist heritage. At the beginning of the retreat from socialism to capitalism under the regime of Boris Yeltsin, Russia even degenerated into a colony of US and European imperialism. Since then, the country has mainly exported resources, not capital. Russia is not a country that lives primarily by exporting capital, importing raw materials and plundering colonies for super profits, quite the reverse. The relationship between Russia's politics and economy is also completely different from that of an imperialist country. In Russia, political circles take the initiative above the economic circles. Many companies, especially in the energy sector, are nationalized in Russia, and they implement the policy of voluntary deviation in which nationalized companies provide cheap supplies to the people and bear their own losses. This is also related to Russia's socialist heritage. This is one of the reasons why Russia has not deviated from the line of anti-imperialism even though it is not a communist and internationalist country. Especially in recent years, Russia has joined the unitary anti-imperialist front, along with North Korea and China, and never derailed or wavered from it. In 2023, the probability of the spread of war in Eastern Europe and the outbreak of war in East Asia is rising. In East Asia, Taiwan and South Korea are the most likely places for wars to break out. When the wars materialize, we should call them the Taiwanese War and the South Korean War. An agreement between the president of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, and the premier of China, Zhou Enlai, in 1961 states that when war in either Taiwan or South Korea breaks out, the other will immediately follow. The prerequisite for this agreement is that it has to be an anti-imperialist war. In the current context, it is clear that such a war will have anti-imperialist character. So it can be affirmed that they will happen almost immediately. The wars in Taiwan and South Korea are anti-imperialist wars, national liberation wars and national reunification wars. Concretely, a war in South Korea is an anti-imperialist and anti-fascist war. When we consider the common point with a war in Taiwan, it is an anti-imperialist war. The wars in Taiwan and South Korea are anti-imperialist wars. They are anti-imperialist wars in which China and North Korea are ostensibly fighting the Taiwanese and South Korean authorities respectively, but in reality they are fighting US imperialism, the true ruling power in Taiwan and South Korea. The imperialist camp includes Japanese militarism and European imperialism which follow US imperialism. Unlike Taiwan, South Korea is a fascist society. It really has fascist evil laws such as the National Security Act and repressive institutions such as the National Intelligence Service. The regime of Yoon Suk-yeol is escalating fascistization by repressing political parties and conducting anti-communist campaigns in South Korea. It describes North Korea as the main enemy, insisting on its right to make a preemptive nuclear strike and holding huge nuclear war exercises one after another. Recently, it joined in forming the US-Japan-South Korea Trilateral Military Alliance to create an Asian version of the NATO. Clearly, the war in South Korea has a relatively more anti-fascist character compared to the war in Taiwan, so it should be considered both an anti-imperialist and an anti-fascist war. The wars in Taiwan and South Korea are national liberation wars. Taiwan has been won with the Chinese mainland since the Middle Ages, and currently, only 1 to 2% of Taiwanese are ethnically Taiwan Aboriginal. The vast majority of Taiwan's people are Chinese. Meanwhile, Korea has been a single nation for over 5,000 years. The war in Taiwan is a national liberation war to free the Chinese people living in Taiwan from the domination of foreign imperialist powers. The war in Korea is a typical national liberation war aimed at establishing the sovereignty of the Korean nation on a nationwide scale, not only in the north but also in the south, driving out the U.S. Army that entered South Korea as an occupying force in September 1945, and finally achieving the national liberation that was left incomplete in August 1945. The wars in Taiwan and South Korea are national reunification wars. Taiwan and South Korea are the targets of the reunification, which is at the very heart of both China's and North Korea's core interests. Taiwan was separated from the Chinese mainland when Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan, and South Korea was divided from the north by the U.S. occupying forces. The people in Taiwan and South Korea have as a result had to suffer the pain of division for more than 70 years. There is no more important task or need for the Chinese and Koreans than resolving this issue of their country's division. There are many ethnic nations in the world that have been divided by foreign powers, and Korea is a representative example. That is why the war in Korea will be a representative national reunification war. North Korea describes the war in South Korea as the South Korean Liberation War. This reflects North Korea's recognition that it had already been liberated on August 15, 1945, and its determination to complete the victory that was only partially achieved on July 27, 1953. This concept also implies a national liberation war and a national reunification war. Thus, the concept of the South Korean Liberation War centers on the goal of the war rather than the target of the war, that is, national liberation and national reunification rather than anti-imperialism and anti-fascism. Anti-imperialist, anti-fascist, liberation, preventive, national liberation and national reunification wars are all just wars. The character of the war is defined depending on one's position. In this respect, for Marxists and anti-imperialists, the just character of these wars is historically, morally and scientifically proven and undeniable. As we know, WW1 was an inter-imperialist war, WW2 was an anti-fascist war. Following the war in Ukraine, if wars break out in Taiwan and South Korea, WW3 will be in full swing. The common point of the wars in Ukraine, Taiwan, South Korea is that they are anti-imperialist wars. Absolutely, WW3, the anti-imperialist war, is a just war as like WW2, the anti-fascist war. A just war may not necessarily be won, but political and moral superiority is undoubtedly one of the main factors that assist in it towards victory. If you have the way and means to achieve the goal of justice, namely, a strong army and exceptional operations, the chances of victory are close to perfection. And if the goal of justice is achieved, humanity has the opportunity to take a great leap forward. We will fight together and win together. Contribution to the commemoration of the 58th anniversary of the massacres in Indonesia, on September 8, 2023, published in the Platform Number 5. Indonesia's tragedy is our tragedy. The tragedy is to suffer, whether we are the people of a colony or the workers of an imperialist country. For as long as imperialism exists, the tragedies like that suffered by the Indonesian people will be repeated many times. In order to liberate themselves from invasion, subjugation, genocide, oppression, exploitation and suffering, all the peoples of the world must fight to the end against the imperialists and their proxies. The Indonesian Communist Party, once the third largest in the world, has experienced periods of rise and fall since its founding in 1920, but the indomitable Indonesian communist and working people had to suffer the greatest hardship in 1965. In the wake of an infamous false flag operation, of the kind that the imperialist powers and their proxies are accustomed to using all over the world, a regime change operation was effected. Sukarno was replaced by Suharto and a massacre of communists and pro-Sukarno forces was perpetrated. The dead were never counted, but it is believed that 800,000 party members were done to death in this horrific bloodbath of progressive forces. More than 1 million people were imprisoned, more than 1,000 were exiled abroad, and more than 3 million workers and peasants were massacred in total nationwide. Anyone who was thought to have sympathy for the communists was a target during this US-directed massacre, a slaughter comparable to the crimes against the humanity committed by the Nazis during WW2. We are confident that the communists and working people in Indonesia will rise like a phoenix and surely rebuild the Communist Party, creating a new people-centered society where the working people become the masters of their country and means of production, where everything serves the needs of the working people. We are also sure that they will drive out imperialism, liquidate its puppets and realize a true people's democracy where there will be no more slavery or genocide. Strongly believing in the truth of history, in the dialectical law of the negation, which shows how progress is achieved through contradictions and vicissitudes, we are convinced that the tragic misfortune in the history of Indonesia will ultimately be transformed into its fortune. We are certain that this is the path of human history, and that all of the people of the world will follow this path. Indonesia is a part of Asia and of the world. The revolution in each country is a part of the world revolution. The individual and the universal are closely related as one. When the Indonesian revolution goes forward, so does the world revolution, and vice versa. When the world revolution is progressing, the Indonesian revolution is, too. Our revolution is a revolution that advances to the full realization of people's independence in their country, also that of advancing to the full realization of all humanity's independence through achieving global independence. Every communist must be an internationalist, and a true internationalist must be a communist. At present, the biggest and most important event in the world is the war in Ukraine. This war, which was escalated in Eastern Europe in 2022, is on the verge of spreading into wars in Taiwan and South Korea in East Asia. Today, in 2023, the probabilities of the spread of war in Eastern Europe and of the outbreak of war in East Asia are rising. When war breaks out in East Asia, it will become clear that we are in a world war. History will record that the Third World War began in Eastern Europe in February 2022 and came into full swing with the breakout of war in East Asia. Taiwan is in the middle of East Asia, and South Korea is to its north. Indonesia is to its south. If war breaks out in the east and northeast of Asia, and WW3 becomes full-blown, Indonesia will not be left out. In fact, the president of the Philippines said during a recent visit to Japan that the Philippines would be involved if a war breaks out in Taiwan. It has been reported that, besides the Philippines, Indonesia is preparing an operation to evacuate those of its citizens who are presently living in Taiwan. The USA also conducted an evacuation exercise last May. The USA, which suffered the unforgettable nightmare of being expelled from North Vietnam and Afghanistan, has a clear case of evacuation trauma. Wars in Taiwan and South Korea are most likely to break out simultaneously. An agreement to this effect was signed in 1961 between the president of the DPRK, Kim Il-sung, and the premier of China, Zhou Enlai, and was apparently reaffirmed when President Xi Jinping visited North Korea to meet Chairman Kim Jong-un in 2019. If one is pulled into a war against U.S. imperialism, the other will automatically follow, forcing U.S. imperialism to wage its war on two battlefields simultaneously, Taiwan and South Korea. With NATO also running the war in Ukraine, the USA will in fact have to fight in three theaters, since it is the main, directing force within the NATO alliance. Moreover, not only Russia, but also China and the DPRK are nuclear and missile powers armed with all kinds of advanced weapons, including hydrogen bombs and tactical nuclear bombs, and with various sort of missile, including hypersonic missiles unrivaled by Western armories. These three countries, which have been superhumanly patient in the face of imperialist provocations, have said that they will not stand for it anymore and have launched a decisive counterattack, beginning with Russia's special military operation to stop NATO's advance into Ukraine. If the wars over Taiwan and South Korea break out soon, U.S. imperialism will have to fight a fierce war on 3 battlefields against the 3 nuclear and missile powers. Moreover, these wars are all expeditionary, making them very unfavorable to U.S. imperialism. Above all, the anti-imperialist, national liberation and preventive war being waged by Russia and the anti-imperialist, national liberation and reunification wars being forced onto China and the DPRK are clearly just wars, with progress and socialist justice on their sides. Thus Russia, China, and North Korea have launched or are preparing to launch wars that are superior not only militarily and technologically but also politically and morally. Whereas WW1 was an inter-imperialist war and WW2 was an anti-fascist war, WW3 will be characterized as an anti-imperialist war. The imperialist powers are increasingly jeopardizing their position through waging this world war and are on the path of decline and destruction. As a result of WW1, the world's first socialist country emerged, and as a result of WW2, the number of socialist countries increased more than tenfold, and the progressive and revolutionary movements reached an unprecedented high. WW3 will deal a decisive blow to imperialism and bring about a new phase of history and revolution. The World Anti-Imperialist Platform, which emerged in the present period of great transformation and turn of history, will fulfill the mission of justice dictated by our times. It will realize the 3 goals of waging anti-imperialist struggle on worldwide scale, of conducting a fierce ideological struggle against opportunism, and of strengthening the international communist forces, taking the lead in promoting revolution in each country and global independence movements worldwide. We believe in the slogans "Workers of the world, unite," and "The people united will never be defeated." We are convinced of the scientific truth, the truth of revolution, that the united struggle of the working people, led by the working class, will be victorious. We will stand firmly united with the working people and the communists in Indonesia, stand firmly against our common enemies, and remain firmly committed to the ultimate achievement of a brilliant victory together. Under the banner of anti-imperialism, let us eliminate the source of war and bring forward the final victory. Contribution to the international forum organized by the Pole of Communist Revival in France, PRCF, at the Fête de l'Humanité in Paris, on September 17, 2023. On September 13, 2023, North Korean Chairman Kim Jong-un and Russian President Putin have held talks at the Vostochny Cosmodrome in Russia. The leaders of the 2 countries, which have the weapons and resources needed by each other, shared views on the regional and global situation and agreed on strengthening more strategic cooperation in all fields including military and economy. North Korea is no longer the country that had to endure an arduous march in the mid to late 1990s, just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, nor is Russia the country that degenerated into a colony of Western imperialism during the Boris Yeltsin era. Not surprisingly, socialist North Korea and capitalist Russia, which retains much of its socialist heritage, cooperate closely and fight on a single anti-imperialist front. Last August, the U.S., Japanese, and South Korean leaders met at Camp David in the U.S. and agreed to establish a de facto Asian version of NATO. South Korea has already supplied Ukraine with massive amounts of weapons including artillery shells and tanks through the U.S. and Poland. South Korea's pro-U.S. puppet President Yoon Suk-yeol, who attended the NATO summit in Madrid, Spain, in June 2022, the G7 summit in Hiroshima, Japan, in May 2023 and the NATO summit in Vilnius, Lithuania, in July 2023, has been making frantic efforts to form an Asian version of NATO and participate in nuclear war maneuvers against North Korea. Yoon Suk-yeol is pushing for the fascistization of South Korean society, following the example of the Ukrainian authorities. He tries to arrest the leader of the reformist opposition, accuses progressive parties of being anti-state and seeks to control the media at all costs. In the face of the worst economic crisis and the ruin of people's livelihoods, the Yoon government, whose approval ratings have plummeted to 20% less than a year after taking office, seems to have no other option but fascistization and war. As you know, the war broke out in Ukraine in 2022, and the war is imminent in South Korea in 2023. Whether it's the war in Ukraine that has already taken place or the war in South Korea that is about to happen, they all have one thing in common: they were triggered by imperialist provocations. This is the same with the war in Taiwan. according to the agreement between North Korean President Kim Il-sung and Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai in 1961 and the reaffirmation between North Korean President Kim Jong-un and Chinese President Xi Jinping in 2019, North Korea and China are bound to fight together automatically if one of them goes to war with imperialism. In other words, if the war breaks out in Taiwan, the war will follow in South Korea, and vice versa. In short, as of September 2023, the risks of war spreading in Eastern Europe and war breaking out in East Asia are increasing. Just as Ukraine threatened Russia by attempting to join NATO, Taiwan is threatening China by demanding its separation and independence, and South Korea is threatening North Korea by conducting nuclear war exercises. Zbigniew Brzezinski's notorious grand chessboard strategy and the color revolutions, taking place everywhere, are not only against Russia but also against China. For China, Taiwan is the most core interest of all its core interests, a vital issue, just as Ukraine is the Maginot Line that Russia can no longer concede. For China and North Korea, the war in Taiwan and the war in South Korea are just wars, as the anti-imperialist war regarding the target of struggle, the National Liberation War and the National Reunification War considering the purpose of struggle. For Russia, the Ukraine war is an anti-imperialist and anti-fascist war against NATO and neo-Nazi authorities, the targets of struggle. It is a liberation war to save the Russian people from oppression and massacres by the neo-Nazi groups. It is a just war since it is a preventive war to defend against the invasion of Western imperialists, trying to turn Russia into a second Yugoslavia. There can be no doubt that scientific analysis of the situation and the establishment of a revolutionary strategy, unshakable in the face of all propaganda, are essential tasks for the communist forces. Under the condition that war in Ukraine has already broken out in Eastern Europe, if the wars in Taiwan and South Korea begin, it certainly will become the Third World War. In that case, the war in Ukraine will have been the start of the Third World War, and the wars in Taiwan and South Korea will be written in human history as the point that the Third World War enters full swing. Imperialist forces are trying to make a new confrontational structure confrontation by means of a limited war, i.e. a local, proxy and hybrid war, while sacrificing Ukraine, Taiwan and South Korea. Imperialist forces, which waged the Cold War right after the Second World War, are scheming the new Cold War through the Third World War. Those imperialist forces, which kid themselves with the victory in the Cold War, have a foolish delusion that they can also win in the new Cold War. Having already demonized Russia, the imperialist forces are embarking on a dangerous and desperate adventure to escape from the unprecedented political and economic crisis by demonizing not only North Korea, but also China, which has grown into a global power that threatens the US's global hegemony. As 1.5 years of war in Ukraine proves, the tactic of isolating and weakening Russia has been indubitably defeated. Russia has become stronger militarily, politically and economically, and the US and Europe have been troubled with their opposite situation. Imperialist forces are trying to deny the fact that not only are China but also North Korea nuclear and missile powers like Russia, but that reality is reality. The imperialist strategy of NATO without the US, that is, Western imperialism fighting Russia in Eastern Europe, while the US and Japan fight China and North Korea in East Asia, is not certain to win, even by their strategic simulation. The strategy that imperialist forces, including the US, will defeat 3 rivals simultaneously in 3 battlefields, Ukraine, Taiwan, South Korea, is totally reckless. The very concept of proxy war means wearing down the adversary rather than defeating it. The progress of the Second World War as an anti-fascist war over the First World War as an inter-imperialist war is fully demonstrated by the fact that it enabled the transition from a small number of socialist states to the emergence of numerous socialist states on a global scale. In fact, the imperialist powers did not dare to wage an inter-imperialist war after the Second World War. When the Third World War is in full swing and the defeat of imperialism becomes more evident not only in Eastern Europe but also in East Asia, humanity will sense and be inspired by the new political situation of the new great upsurge on a global scale, identical to the period of the Second World War. In this sense, it is undeniable that the present era is a period of great turn in human history. Based on the scientific analysis of this international political situation, the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, the Platform, emerged in October last year in Paris, France, calling for anti-imperialist struggle on a global scale. For this reason, the 3 main goals of the platform are the anti-imperialist mass struggle, the anti-opportunism ideological battle, and the reinforcement of international communist forces. The platform held international conferences last December in Belgrade, Serbia, last March in Caracas, Venezuela, and last May in Seoul, South Korea, and carried out the World Anti-Imperialist Joint Struggle. Furthermore, it plans to hold an anti-imperialist event in Athens, Greece, this November, on the occasion of the 50 years of the Polytechnic University uprising which ended the military dictatorship, and is organizing large-scale anti-imperialist events in Africa and Middle East next year. The World Anti-Imperialist Platform will fight together and win together, especially with the people of the Third World, who have been the direct victim of imperialism. For us, the slogans that proletarians of all countries unite and people united will never be defeated are unshakable scientific convictions, despite any oppression and hardship. Holding high the banner of anti-imperialism and socialism, we firmly unite on one front against one common enemy, eliminate the root of war, and advance forward the day of the final victory, where the people become the real masters of society.